And that's what I'm going to do to this guy, because you can actually see, you can trace the years of growth. So it was cut back to here. This is 1 year's growth. There was a previous cut made there. So all the way up to probably about, well, there is another year's growth. For a lot of the panicle hydrangeas, the harder you cut them, the more regrowth they send up. And same goes for the Annabelles. So the arborescens, they do the same thing. The harder you cut them, the stronger they grow, and then the bigger your heads are.
Okay, so it's really good for them.
Yeah, yeah.
So the one that they push a lot in the nurseries, the limelight.
Yes.
When can you prune those?
Oh, right now, yeah. Really, you can prune them any time of the year. And I'll just go ahead and get started, and I'll hopefully answer some of the questions on that. All right, everyone, so we are going to do a quick demonstration of how to prune this hydrangea here. So this species of hydrangea is Hydrangea paniculata, or the panicle hydrangea. If you've ever used the cultivars Limelight, Little Lime, Quickfire, Strawberry Blonde, there's a whole bunch of them. It would be in this group. PG is another. There's a dwarf one that's called Bobo out there now. There's a whole bunch. This is one of the more sun-tolerant hydrangeas. And it blooms on new growth. So hydrangeas will bloom on either old growth or new growth. So what that means is this guy, I can cut it, and it will rebloom every single year. The big blue pinkish flowered hydrangeas, that's Hydrangea macrophylla, that blooms on old wood. So for us, normally it gets killed to the ground by cold, but if you cut it back, you're removing your flower buds. So the species that we want to do the heavier pruning practices on are the ones that only bloom on the new wood. Otherwise, you would want to prune it as soon as it flowers. That way it can set those buds for the next year. Oak leaf hydrangea is one that blooms on old growth. So if you take an oak leaf hydrangea that's like this size, you cut it back really hard, you're going to remove your flower buds for the current year. So if you're thinking about doing reduction pruning on that species, do it right after flower. For this one and the other new growth bloomers, there's some things to consider when we do some pruning. So this one, my only goal is to manage the height. I want to bring this down, get some more light in the space, not just have a big old chunk and bush here, even though it's a beautiful specimen. If your concern was for cut flowers, or you are really trying to maximize your flower production, there are ways you can manage the pruning to do so. So things I want to point out, and some people were hearing me talk about this before, but I'll make sure everyone can hear it. You can actually trace how much growth is done in a single season by these plants. So we can see last year we had a pruning cut here where we have these nice big bunches come out, and then you can actually see before there was a cut made here. So this is all one season of growth from there to there, and then this was last season's growth when it didn't really get pruned as severely. With hydrangeas, this species and then smooth hydrangeas, so your Annabelles, you can generally expect about 2 foot of growth from where you cut last if you're doing a heavy pruning. Some of the smaller cultivars don't grow that much, but what will happen is when you do this, your flower heads will get a lot bigger. So these are about average for botanical hydrangeas. I don't know what cultivar this is, but they're smaller than they would be. So if you watch this summer after we do this heavy pruning, come and just compare the size of these flower heads to what we will have this summer. They're going to be a lot bigger, and that's just because there's going to be less of them produced, so they'll be a lot larger. For your Annabelle hydrangeas, a lot of people cut those to the ground, or they cut them to knee height, and there's a big issue with the flowers flopping because they get too big. If you want to reduce the floppiness of your Annabelles, don't prune them as hard, or just don't prune them at all, because you're going to have a lot more flowers and they'll be smaller, so they won't be as heavy and tip over. But if you cut them to the ground or you cut them to your knee, you're going to have fewer but bigger, and you may need to stake them to keep them from flopping over. So that's just something to keep in mind as we prune. Ideally, when we do pruning, it's nice to always cut back to a bud. So if we were to make the first cut and I was just doing this for maintenance and not for heading back, I would find where a whorl of branches come out, and I would make the cut there. That way it'll force the growth on these. When we do the heading back cuts or the heavy rejuvenations, that's not so much of an issue. Ideally, if we know we're going to find a bud, That would be a good thing to note, but it doesn't have to, and we can always just trim any dead wood off. So I'm going to go ahead and get all up in here and hopefully not step on any of the bulbs I've planted. And my goal is to reduce the height actually lower than this because, like we said, this is all one season of growth. So if I just cut back to here, this shrub will be the same size as it is by the end of the season. So I'm actually going to take it back a little heavier down to here. These hydrangeas are very resilient and you can cut them pretty hard and they don't bind it. You wouldn't want to do it every year, but on a couple of year cycle is average for when we're doing a rejuvenation style pruning, and that's exactly what we're doing today is rejuvenation pruning.
What if you didn't prune it at all? You just get a lot of, would it grow much taller?
So yeah, this will just keep growing. So we can see last year's growth.
You think you'd get that much?
This would probably keep on happening. It is regulated by the cultivar, so since I don't know what cultivar this is, I have no idea what the mature size.
Okay.
I have seen panicle hydrangeas that are pushing 20 foot tall that have just never been pruned before.
Okay.
Most of the modern cultivars are not designed to get that large. They've bred them to be smaller, more compact, because no one wants the big honking things there. And generally we do recommend going through every 3 to 5 years and kind of reducing the height just to make sure you're keeping the blooms more compact. Because what will happen is, especially if you're near a structure, it'll start to lean forward and your back won't have as many flowers as the front does. It'll thin out a little bit on the inside, and it makes rejuvenation harder in the long term if you let it get too big without periodically going in and thinning it out. But if you just want a big old honking shrub, you don't have to do this. It's just purely what your goals are for the plant and your landscape. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to start making the first couple cuts. Let's see. Making the first cut's always the hardest. But we're going to go through, and I really want to head it back to about this height here. So we're going to cut, and I'm going to make sure I'm cutting just outside of that branch. And I'm actually, before I do that, going to make my life easier.
So can I ask you something before you make that big cut?
Yes.
So like I was just standing back here and looking at that branch right there by your right back, that one.
Yes.
See, that would have been the very first one I took off.
I am doing this one just because I don't really have a good place to say where to start when you're doing the rejuvenation pruning. The goal will be for me to have all of these branches kind of tiered in a way that I think is going to give me the best structure. And as long as you're keeping that thought process in mind, it doesn't matter. I could have easily started back here, but I am really looking at these bigger branches and figuring out where I want that to come back from first.
That one looked so much like almost like the sucker. I would have probably taken it.
Oh, some of these here?
Straight up,
Well,
yeah.
and that's what will happen. So as I do this, as I cut all of this off, we're going to have a big flush of suckers come up to reestablish that canopy. This is exactly what this branch was. It was a sucker that came up off the base and is trying to form a new canopy sprout. You know, it never got pruned. You can see that it just grew until last year where it flowered up there. So yeah, and this is the one thing with pruning, there are a million different ways to do it. Some are inherently wrong, but a lot of them, it's just a choice of where your priority lies first. So we could have started here, and I can start there. As long as your end results are the same and you're not making cuts that are going to damage or be hard to heal, then it really doesn't matter. For trees, if this was a young tree, my first priority would be the dead wood. But where I'm basically cutting this to stubs, I'm not too worried about removing dead first. So we're gonna go ahead, I'm gonna make...
Grew that much in a drought.
Oh yeah, no, these guys, once they're established, they take off like a rocket. There's that one, and you'll notice I'm cutting a little long. I can always come back here and head this off. I don't want to cut too close to this collar so that it dries out. If this were a tree and we were doing a reduction cut, that's a little long, but for the shrubs, they grow so fast, they rejuvenate so quickly that it's not as much of an issue. So that little stubby is not the end of the world, and I'll actually clean this branch up too so it's not as long. But yeah, and if you guys have questions as we go, please ask them.
Tyson, when you talked about tiered, where this is facing the parking lot, would you do shorter in the front and then longer in the back? Is that what you're referring to when you said tiered?
Like a rounded.
I'm going to make it perfectly rounded. I'm going to make sure that the branches on the back side are short. I want this, when you're looking out the door, looking down the side, to be kind of symmetrical all the way around. It's never going to happen because the building's here. But I'm not super duper worried about making the back taller than the front. In fact, that's kind of something I'm hoping to minimize, because I don't want to encourage it to keep getting taller along the back more so than the front. So that's my goal. But if you're making a screen, that's something you can plan for, is thinning the front out a little more to make it fuller, having more natural taper, and then keeping your back taller.
What are you referring to when you say tiered?
So tiered. What was the context I said tiered?
Well, when you were talking about removing this one, and I asked you about that sucker, and you said you might cut it a little bit taller.
Oh, okay. So yeah. So tiers are just kind of, and I probably just threw that term out there without really thinking about it, but with some plants you can really develop a solid framework of, I have a branch here, I have a branch starting here, I have a branch starting here.
So kind of like layers?
In layers in a way. So if we're thinking about tiers for this branch I will cut shorter than this one, just because this is our taller point on the plant, and I want this to branch out and more fill in this way. So in terms of thinking of a tier, I'll probably cut this one down to here, and this branch I'll probably cut somewhere in this section here. And I'm hoping that, well, I'll probably have to come out and thin a couple suckers to keep it from shooting that way. Does that help explain a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And I always like to make my big cuts first. That way I can look at the smaller stuff later. Like I said, there's really not a terribly wrong way to do this.
And why can you just, I think you already said it, but I didn't read it. Why can you just, what?
Didn't believe it.
Oh, no, why are you able just to cut it like on a fruit tree or something, or other things? I mean, like I would be looking for the buds, and I would go, okay.
So
why can you do it like this?
I'm kind of trying to keep that in mind, but on some of these thicker branches, you're not going to see where those epicormic shoots will develop. So the dormant buds that we don't see, they'll still come out. I'll probably have a huge flush come out of this collar region here, and I may have a couple activate. Like I can feel where there used to be a twig right there.
Yeah.
So hopefully I've left enough room to where that doesn't dry out and I get some buds that develop.
Okay.
On rejuvenation prunings for shrubs, it really doesn't matter. You can cut wherever, because your goal is not in the first year to get a good structure. It's just to, I want to drop the height.
Yeah.
And then year 2, I can go through, I can clean it up. So if I've got crossing branches, I've got ones going places I don't want, I can tweak them further then. But since my primary goal is just to drop this down, make it fuller, I'm just trying to get as much shoot regeneration as possible, and I don't really care where that comes from right now.
I didn't realize there were buds or whatever that E word you use.
Epicormic?
That there's stuff in, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so all woody plants will have those. They're called epicormic shoots because they don't generate from meristematic tissue. So if you have any buds that break from where there's not a meristem, so that's typically where we have undifferentiated cells. So the tip of a bud, that would be an apical meristem, but there's also meristematic tissue in the collar region that will send out buds too. But we can have shoots come up anywhere from here. It's why if you've ever seen someone top a tree, you get all those water sprouts that come up everywhere.
Yeah, that's
A lot of those are generating from epicormic shoots or tissues that weren't already there, and that's why they take so long to come back out.
Okay.
If we were doing more of a maintenance pruning that wasn't, I'm cutting it down, I would be a lot more choosy. I would be like, okay, I want to reduce the height, but I want to keep the structure. I'll cut here. That way I have those 2 branches. And for like structural pruning of trees, that's what you're trying to do. It's just with shrubs, when you're doing rejuvenation pruning, you could be brutal and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And actually we encourage that.
Back to the ground.
You probably could with this one. If I wanted to be super duper aggressive, I could even go so far as to cut it back to this stump here. I would not cut into the stump, but I would probably cut everything that's coming off of that, because then we'll get a bunch of flush coming out of that. I don't want to be that aggressive. I don't have a need to, but if I really wanted to, I could. I've done that with elderberries. I've done that with calycanthus. So if anyone has the Aphrodite calycanthus, I've cut those to where there's nothing left, and they come springing right back up.
When
Right
should
here.
you? Because I have some. Well, I have the native, like the when do you prune those? Because all my stuff is really still small.
Yeah. If you have the straight native species, they don't normally grow quick enough to where that's an issue until they start getting big. The only thing I would watch out for is thinning out suckers. If you have Aphrodite though, that one's a monster. That's a hybrid with an Asiatic species, and it has the definition of hybrid vigor. I mean, it'll hit 15 foot easy. And so that one, depending on your size constraints, you would prune it. Anytime you're doing rejuvenation pruning, basically this is kind of the latest I would go. Some species you can go into March, but February is the golden child for doing rejuvenation because your buds haven't started to swell. The plant has not started pushing energy from here up to here, so we're not taking energy out of the system. It's still going to flush out just fine. Some people will tell you to do it in the fall because that's before it even pulls all that energy down, so your resulting spring flush isn't as vigorous, but I always say do it now because you can see what's going on and you can actually, time it appropriately. But yeah. And like I said, I am very aggressive when I did this. Worked for a botanic garden for 3 years doing very aggressive rejuvenation pruning. You just start to not worry. We have literally taken like 15-foot tall viburnums down to about the height of my shin before. I mean, sometimes you can just be exceptionally aggressive and it doesn't really matter.
So when you get that flush around the collar, are you going to come in and thin out?
Yes, so yeah, if I was really being on my game, I would be watching this guy throughout the summer and kind of correcting the stuff that...
Well, even in a few weeks when you get that whole flush?
I could, but I will probably wait until summer when it's a little bit more solidified before I would come out here and thin.
Okay.
Realistically, I think for most cases you could wait until the spring and then kind of go through, pick and choose, see where the plant wants to grow and then make your cuts that way.
Okay.
But it's all up to you and how involved you want to be. I know people that are very involved in their rejuvenation regrowth, and I know people that just don't care at all and they'll thin it out the following year.
I'm just worried that all that little fresh growth, I should narrow it down to a few to
You
let
could.
that be stronger.
Yeah, you could. With some stuff, it's more beneficial that way. So like, let's say I had a tree that got cut back to a stump and I wanted it to resprout that way, I would be a lot more selective in that regard. So like my partner's parents, they had a tree take down another tree, they left the stump, and then they have a bunch of suckers coming up the base. In that regard, I would be a lot more proactive of trying to thin that down to a handful than ultimately one. But with these guys, it's not so much of a concern, especially since they're just kind of multi-stemmed anyways. I'm trying to be respectful of your time. I cannot work and talk at the same time. It's just not something I can do. I learned that at the conservatory. And sometimes when you're making these cuts, you don't have to know where you want it to be at first. You can make it wider and then always go in. That's the most important thing, is until you know where you want it, it's always safer to cut further out than it is to go in, because I can't reattach that. That's done. That is done. It can get no longer. But some of these guys I know that I'm going to want shorter, and that's fine.
See, I don't like that wobbly one down there.
Yeah, I'm gonna thin that one out a lot. I just wanted it out of the way.
Ooh, look at that. No, look at this. They're real hard. So gray.
And like I said, that comes with doing this for a job for 3 years. You just, the stuff that most people are like, oh, that's a lot. You just start hacking. I promise you, this thing will respond and it'll look fantastic. And we will get to watch it, and we'll get to see how my techniques were, what we liked, what we didn't like about it.
So like right now, it would be nice if we had a sign on a piece of corrugated cardboard, plastic corrugated cardboard that said,
Explain
you know,
why it looks the way it
explain,
does.
yeah, talk about why.
Yes, so yeah, we could,
It talks about why.
yeah, So like
we
this,
did this.
so this would be a perfect opportunity. And if I was thinking, we could have took a before
Taking a
picture, but
I know it.
you know, we could put a sign that says, "Oh, this is an example of rejuvenation
I have
pruning."
I have a picture of it from the summer.
And you're getting filmed right now.
I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pam wanted me to film it first. She had to leave.
Yeah, I can send it to you if somebody wanted to, you know, make some narrative that just said, you know, rejuvenation project. And so this could be starting the part of our education.
Well, we make a sign like, you know, leave the leaves. Put that in.
Just put the two, before and after we've done rejuvenation. This is rejuvenation.
Well, yeah, working on rejuvenation or, I mean, it hasn't been rejuvenated yet. It's just,
Yeah. That's up your road.
Witch hazel.
Oh, that's what I have witch hazel, but the flowers didn't look like that.
So this is that's the those have already flowered.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
They
So
flower last fall?
They flowered in the fall, so yes.
that's a native witch
Did
hazel.
you see it?
It is, okay, that's what I
It
have.
came
today,
from
witch hazel,
Malaysia.
but it was more.
Are they
Yeah,
dangly,
yeah.
droopy?
More typical witch hazel.
Yeah.
Cultivar.
That looks more like a.
We want that.
This is a straight native species that we have.
Yeah, mine is too.
Well, that looks pretty.
Yeah, I'm feeling better when I do.
I like it. I do too. Oh, we can
It's
see
house
them
cleaning.
building.
Really, I wish we had some smaller branches at the bottom on this side, but that's all right. Hopefully we'll get some. Oh, and hopefully I didn't crush that. I put some of our native wild ginger behind this guy, and I'm hoping I didn't crush it, but I probably did. Oh well.
So Tyson, I have, according to an app, a smooth hydrangea.
Yes.
I have no idea what it is. It flowers white, but it looks more like it's coming out from underneath.
Yes.
Like,
So
it's-
that
it's
species
not
is
like-
rhizomatous.
Yeah.
And in that case, so a lot of what people will do when that one gets too big and they don't like it, they'll just cut it all the way to the
Okay, so
ground.
that's what we've done.
I've
Go over with the mower.
So yeah, you can do it that way. If you want to thin and select, you can go through and thin out some of the suckers. It's entirely your prerogative on how you want to manage that one. One thing I would discourage, depending on the cultivar, is don't do this, because normally when you do this, they send up a few shoots and they get the really heavy heads that just flop. Annabelle is notorious for that. If you over prune that one, you just get a bunch of sad floppy growth. I mean, the flowers are like the size of basketballs, so they're cool in that regard, but as soon as you get a summer rain, they go
So I was hoping that would be.
So it's better for Annabelle just to leave it, right?
that's my advice, yeah, is just leave Annabelle alone.
But that sucker's so bad. I've been trying to pull it back.
Yeah, and so if you're trying to control it that way, you know, that's a management consideration. Is you have a goal in mind. No, it's an aggressive one. And I'm just back here cleaning up some dead stalks from where this was cut to the ground previously. And this branch is probably not going to be a good permanent one moving forward. Actually, that whole thing is dead.
It's dead.
So,
Brittany, scooch over.
Sorry.
More
You
gentlemen.
just took it off the backside.
Oh, well, I'm standing in. Sorry.
so yes. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I could probably cut more if I wanted, but I think